Whew. All right. Greetings, everyone. Thank you for joining the Naturalist Exchange, and to Christy for providing an opportunity for me to present on this importance of preserving wetlands and their impact on environmental justice communities. Let's see. Okay, so this is an overview of what we're going to discuss. Again, an overview of Graniteville Wetlands on Staten Island. There's a retail development project that's being proposed on the site, so I'll just go over that, those issues. I'll then take a look at the impact on the community and why it's a local environmental justice issue. We'll do a quick overview of just wetland protections in New York State, and then we'll close with a call to action. I'll play a short clip here for you that gives you an overview of the wetland.
Wetlands have always been incredibly important. They are the interface between land and water, and they, for that reason, are incredibly rich in biodiversity.
They're sponges. They absorb stormwater, storm surges, probably better than any system known to man.
With climate change, the function that wetlands serve as buffers is becoming enormous. The New York Harbor estuary has lost a lot of its wetlands over time, but one place where there were opportunities to protect wetlands was Staten Island.
In New York City, we live on top of historic marshes. They are very vulnerable places. Hurricane Sandy was a tragic event for Staten Island. The South Shore was clearly inundated and lives were lost.
There was a lot I couldn't save. Everything's just gone. It's gone.
Here on the North Shore of Staten Island, it was a very different story. Here we see vast expanses of marshes. We see an area that's 8 miles long. It has substantial amounts of tidal wetlands, and freshwater wetlands, and freshwater forests.
This is truly one of the remarkable stories that occurred in this region. This was a huge outlet for helping to abate a lot of the flooding that occurred. The marshes of Old Place Creek were crucial in protecting the mobile home complex.
It wasn't that bad over here. Maybe a foot of water came up. We didn't really get hit that hard. Yeah, South Shore got it the most.
Those homes, those livelihoods were preserved, and so many of the jobs that are being supported by Staten Island Corporate Park and the Staten Island Hilton and all the little businesses in between are really helping to support local communities.
Oftentimes wetlands are proximate to cities and targets for development.
So at one time, this street was going to have, 5 million square feet of office space on it in all these wetlands. When the storm came, the wetlands did accept a lot of the water and didn't come that high and affect any of our buildings. What we've done here at the corporate park of Staten Island, it's a good combination of development and protection of wetlands.
This had been a boatyard. It was the first post-Sandy waterfront resilient park built. We're in construction in 9 of them right now across the city.
We call it green infrastructure, be an important part of the solution.
The acquisition of these lands had a great impact on what we see here in the northwest corner of Staten Island today.
The Trust for Public Land helped to protect several thousand acres of marsh system. If the Trust for Public Land had not been there, there would have been significantly more damage than there was. If we are anticipating, as the climatologists are all telling us, close to 3 feet or more of sea level rise over the next 30 to 50 years, we're not going to rebuild bigger and stronger than the storm.
We should be protecting every square inch of wetlands that we have right now.
It's these lands that really help to reduce some of the horrible events of the Katrinas, of the Sandys, of the Hurricane Irenes. conservation as really the first line of defense that we have in protecting our communities.
There is an urgency now to protect the land that nurtures us.
Great. So I hope you found that video informative, or you got a little background on Graniteville Wetlands, and that is actually in my community in Graniteville, Staten Island. According to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services, the status of wetlands in the U.S. is constantly changing. It is estimated that over 60 acres of wetlands have been lost every hour in the Northeast, and most of that is due to development. So we're going to zoom into Graniteville Wetland and Forest, and you can kind of get an overview of the area and the impact it can have just from these two photos that we're looking at right now and the map on the left. For those of you unfamiliar with the area though, it's located in the northwest section of Staten Island. It's a diverse working class neighborhood that consists of 1- and 2-family homes and townhouses. The community is separated by the Staten Island Expressway, and the area I'm focusing on is adjacent to the wetland. Now, Staten Island once had an abundance of salt marshes with nearly 5,600 acres present in 1870. Since then, about 2/3 of them have been filled, and many of the remaining ones are polluted. The plants that thrive in the wetlands have been reduced on Staten Island due to the destruction of the wetlands. Graniteville is situated close to New Jersey, and this circled area will also be discussed because it's the location of petrochemical refineries located in Linden, New Jersey, another fence line community that is dealing with similar health, wealth, and environmental issues. These refineries are one of the major contributors to air and water pollution in the region. Graniteville Wetlands is unique, as you saw in the video, because it contains broad expanses of both swamp and upland forest. In addition to marshes and creeks, the woods of Graniteville Swamp includes pine oak, swamp white oak, sweet gum, and red maple. The forest floor contains trout cinnamon fern, Turk's cap lily, Canada mayflowers, among other plants. Red-winged blackbirds, American woodcock, and many different species of warblers can be found throughout the wetland. This diversity makes the wetland and forest a wonderful place to observe nature, but unfortunately, it's not that accessible to the community. So now we're going to dive into the development plan for the site, called the South Avenue Retail Development Project. Now on September 6th, 2017, the City Planning Commission in New York City issued a favorable report on the South Avenue retail development to be developed on the site. The project involves 2 land use actions: a special permit to allow retail establishments above 10,000 square feet, and a city map amendment to alter and remove unbuilt street maps over wetland areas. The commission found that both land use actions were appropriate. The current developer bought the land in 2 pieces in 1977 and 1984, just before the state started mapping wetlands in adjacent areas where development would be restricted. They fought for years to keep their land off of those maps, and in 2012, the owners agreed to not build residential blocks and to seek a wetland permit. We're having inadvertently, but switch to the next slide. But as you can see, the developer made an agreement with the state, or was offered an opportunity, but it came with restrictions, and the conservation department designated less of the property as protected areas than some experts would have liked and or recommended. And 2 months after that decision, Hurricane Sandy hit. So I'm going to go back to the slide previous to this one because I want to just give an overview of what's going on here. So here are two maps where you can see the proximity of the residential neighborhoods near the wetland and the proposed development site where there's going to be a BJ warehouse store being proposed on the site. So the yellow indicates the residential area and the gray is where the wetland, woodland, forest is. That whole circle area is basically, I guess you could say, the immediate impact area. The next two slides that we'll show, we'll look at what was approved, and the developer had the right to build as of right, and there was a plan that was negotiated. So what we're looking at is the negotiated approved plan. Approximately 2,000 mature trees will be removed to develop the site. The project would result in development on a portion of the wetland areas, but would preserve approximately 7 acres of mapped wetland areas. The developer would also provide a landscaped buffer between the retail center and the regulated wetland areas to be preserved. A stormwater management area would also be provided. The proposed site plan is in accordance with the applicant's 2012 agreement with the state. What we're looking at right now is what would have been built without that agreement. And this was as of right. And you can see there's substantially less trees than the first proposal. This is one of our council members in New York City that really stood up for the community and sided with the community in the land use vote. And I just wanted to give her a shout out. But she also represents predominantly a community of color that deals with a lot of environmental justice issues. Our local council member and the borough president decided it was in the best interest to move forward with the plan, given that the developer could build as of right. So now let's look into environmental justice and why this is an environmental justice issue. Just as a general definition for environmental justice, for those who are not familiar with the term, essentially is the right to have access to equal protection, especially for vulnerable communities, to a cleaner environment, right? It shouldn't be based on your zip code, your race. And today, we find that that's not the case. These maps kind of illustrate what the environmental justice issues are on Staten Island. The areas that are more blue are the white communities, or I should say predominantly white communities on Staten Island. The ones with color are typically majority minority communities that seem to be clustered in the North Shore. And if you overlay that with the map on the right, that shows you where some of the environmental justice areas are outlined throughout the throughout the borough. So you can see that there's a correlation between zip code and race and environmental hazards. As I mentioned earlier, that Staten Island and Graniteville in particular is divided by the Staten Island Expressway. So we have higher levels of air pollution from many sources, including living downwind from petrochemical refinery and chemical coast in New Jersey, which I mentioned earlier. We also have more big box stores, fewer public transportation options than the other parts of the city. And we just deal with an incredible amount of noise pollution from Newark Airport. And in addition to having a heat island effect and the risk of urban flooding. So all of these things impact the quality of life and disproportionately impact majority minority communities on Staten Island. And as the communities have grown over the years, this has put more pressure on our infrastructure. So this Graniteville wetland has definitely been an asset to the community. Here we're going to take a look at the flood maps, and you can clearly see on the picture on the right from Hurricane Sandy, the destruction that many Staten Islanders had to deal with, and why we're really working to protect and preserve the wetland, because we don't want to repeat this, we understand that, you know, it was in recent memory, and a lot of people are have lost a lot of property and even loved ones during this super hurricane. So yeah, the map, let me go back. The website on the bottom is an interesting website because you can find out if you live in a flood zone by typing that information, and it's called Flood Help, and it compares the property to the available flood maps. And my community is vulnerable to flooding, and you know, many communities that are in low-lying areas are also at risk. And you know, these flood insurance rates can be very expensive to homeowners, particularly, you know, in communities that are working moderate class or first-time home buyers like myself. Another issue is heat. And I mentioned that over 2,000 trees are going to be removed for this development. And I really just wanted to take the time out to talk about heat-related disparities on Staten Island. As we can see with this map, you know, a lot of heat-related disparities on Staten Island are concentrated on the North Shore. And one of the biggest contributors to urban heat island effect is having more asphalt and concrete. And, you know, removing 2,000 trees and the vegetation along with that will definitely increase heat-related disparities on the North Shore. And there's an interesting article that the New York Times came out with, I think a year or two ago, about the relationship between redlining and the current day intra-urban heat in urban communities across the US, called How Decades of Racist Housing Policy Left Neighborhoods Sweltering. And it was interesting to see how the federal government's role in racial segregation and the lack of investment in minority neighborhoods created present-day disparities in urban heat environments. So neighborhoods that were historically redlined due to the federal government's Homeowners Loan Corporation between 1935 and 1940 tend to be hotter in the summers. And whereas predominantly white communities that were not redlined tend to be cooler during the summer. So according to this article, neighborhoods that are poorer and have more residents of color can be 5 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit hotter in the summer than wealthier, whiter ones in the same city. And we know that extreme heat kills more people on average in the US every year than any other type of weather event. So it's just, you know, to put that within context. So back to the wetlands. It is interesting just to think about how New York regulates it. New York has a comprehensive statewide program for all tidal wetlands, regardless of size, and freshwater wetlands over 12.4 acres, but smaller ones are not necessarily protected in that same way. I came across this idea of mitigation banks to restore wetlands, and I think it's an interesting market-based approach to protect wetlands. Essentially, you know, developers can get credit for building in one area, and some of those funds help to support these wetlands. And we have one on Staten Island, actually, Sawmill Creek, and this is an example of one. It's 54-acre wetland restoration on Staten Island West Shore, and it's an example of, you know, a policy that could be that allows for development to buy credits, as I said, to offset some of the environmental mitigations in other parts of the city. So I also wanted to draw your attention to Freshkill Parks, and I thought this is a really interesting project because not only was it a landfill, Staten Island was home to Fresh Kills, and for many, many years, the community that surrounded Fresh Kills had to deal with a lot of issues, from, you know, the air quality to health issues. And Fresh Kills Parks played an important role during Hurricane Sandy. And the hills and the wetlands of the parks buffered neighboring communities from the effects of the storm surge. So I think like when we think about the role wetlands play, historically, Staten Island, out of all the five boroughs, has the most wetlands out of all of the boroughs in New York City. So this is an issue that I think that for many years, if we look at the history of Staten Island, a lot of the wetlands was seen as wastelands. So there was a lot of dumping. People, you know, one of the reasons why Fresh Kills was turned into a landfill, because people really didn't see the value in it. Now they do. So I think there's definitely more awareness about this, and you know, about how wetlands fit within urban ecology, how and all these other benefits, from urban flooding to heat, and I think you know, we need to basically strengthen our protection to ensure that even the smaller wetlands are, particularly in our urban areas, are protected, and there's still more work to be done. As I mentioned, New York state law does not protect freshwater wetlands that are smaller than 11 acres, like most of the cities like Staten Island. You know, for those who are interested in lending a hand and a voice into protecting this asset, I want to steer you towards the Sierra Club's petition. There's one out right now. It's, you know, you can sign the petition and just lend your voice to protecting Graniteville Wetlands and Forest. Earth Day is, there's basically a rally this Saturday on Graniteville. And it's, you know, I think the community is definitely, no matter what happens, has definitely elevated this issue, not just locally, but citywide and beyond. And I think it's a great opportunity just to highlight how, you know, many of these issues are interconnected. And they're not just talking about wetlands, but communities, about our health is very intersectional and very, you know, as I mentioned, interconnected. And it provides an opportunity for us to reimagine issues around land use, community participation, civic engagement. And when we think about sustainability and ensuring that there's that equity piece that is also in the front of the discussion instead of like an afterthought. And so I just want to end with these two quotes. The nation behaves well if it treats the natural resources as assets, which it must turn over to the next generation, increased and not impaired in value. So that's Theodore Roosevelt, 1907, and Montgomery Mathai. The generation that destroys the environment is not the generation that pays the price. That is the problem. So, you know, this, you know, I think, was that saying, to be forewarned is to be forearmed? And I think we've been forewarned with many hurricanes, from Irene to Hurricane Sandy. And so we really can't use that as an excuse why we don't do adequate regional planning around these issues, and make sure the people who are most affected are at the table as well. So thanks for listening, and I can take any questions that you might have at this time. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Ajamu. That was a lot of good food for thought. If anybody has any questions, you can type them in the chat box, or you can always unmute. Okay, I have one here from Charlene. She asks how climate has affected wetlands.
Well, I think you mean climate change, or?
No, Charlene, do you want to unmute and clarify? Did you mean climate change or climate in general?
Yeah, climate change, because that was going to be one of the topics. So I didn't pick up on how climate change had a place in this.
Yeah, sure. I guess I could have been more specific about that. But as you have more of these superstorms, like Hurricane Sandy, or extreme heat conditions, when you have like wetlands that have this ecological function of doing everything from cleaning water to providing, you know, a buffer, or being able to absorb water as sea level rises. You know, wetlands even become more critically important to protecting both livelihood and property, as well as just, you know, overall, you know, community health. So I think, you know, to answer your question, wetlands have many different functions. Some are, you know, very obvious, from just like, you know, being able to have access to nature, right? Whether it's recreational or otherwise. We also have, you know, the ecosystem that supports wildlife, right? So any reduction in that also impacts wildlife as well. And then of course you have the fact that we've lost so many wetlands that this really just taxes our infrastructure, and particularly when you're looking at a city like New York and or Staten Island, where population growth has put a tremendous strain on the city's infrastructure that hasn't actually kept up. So when you have a wetland that can absorb water, it's hard to replicate that through engineering. You know, you're cutting down 2,000 trees, which took, you know, 10 years or more to grow. It's hard to replace that function, the many functions that a mature tree would have with, you know, any other alternative. So, you know, hopefully that answers your question, but you know, it's going to increasingly be relevant for communities to ensure that there's enough vegetation, that our swamps and wetlands are protected, in order to at least help communities that are, especially ones that are unable to adapt to climate change, be able to have some sort of insurance, right? Protection. And particularly this Graniteville wetland ensures, and it has during Hurricane Sandy, that neighboring communities, we have like near the Gothel Bridge, there's the city's only trailer park community. And they were completely fine during Hurricane Sandy, no flooding whatsoever, you know, and I attribute that to having the wetlands nearby.
Great, thank you. That's somewhat related question. Steve Kinney asks, he says, it's hard for me to visualize how wetlands already containing large amounts of water can absorb enough water from a storm surge to prevent flooding. It must be more than just a physical barrier. Is it because they are spread out and thus can dissipate the force of the surge?
Well, yeah, I'm not the wetlands expert, but from what I gather is like, at least the one right across the street from my house, and this is just my own visual observation, I've actually never seen it like, you know, full of water. It's always seems there's a lot of common reeds throughout the area, and I haven't seen anywhere. But then again, I haven't actually gone in. But just standing across the street, I wouldn't be able to see it. But I can see foreseeably there was like a storm surge that it could probably absorb a good amount of water if that situation did occur. So I guess, and there's different types of wetlands, right? So like, you know, there's wetlands that, you know, are dry most of the year, and there's wetlands that are not, right? So I guess it depends on the level of water that already exists. But for the one that specifically this Graniteville wetland, it's, you know, it's pretty, you know what I'm saying? It depends on what area you're talking about. So I'm just talking about the one that impacts like where I live, and I can definitely say for sure that it would, you know, retain a lot of water if it came down to it. You know, how much specifically, I'm not sure, but just based on Hurricane Sandy and the fact that the community that surrounded that particular wetland walked away pretty unscathed, I would say that, you know, that was a litmus test as to how much it could probably protect the community in the future.
Okay, thank you. So Mary had asked where to find the petition for the Sierra Club. So I looked it up,
Yeah.
and I put that in the chat box for
Oh,
everyone.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Let's see. Guy Jacob asks, and Guy, you may have to unmute to clarify this too. Is there any infrastructure that is planned to help save the wetlands?
Well, again, like this is what the developer is proposing. I can go back to that site. So this is the plan, and I think there, as I mentioned, there was a buffer they're planning to. What side is this? But there are some efforts to enhance the wetland, but so much of it is actually being developed on, so it's hard for me to fully understand if what's being developed on kind of undermines what enhancements are taking place. And again, I'm not an engineer. It's just my casual observation, and I feel like the wooded areas of the wetland definitely worked with the non-wooded section. So I feel like once you remove, a substantial amount of mature trees, that taxes the wetland even more if there was a storm surge, right? Because it has now the water's hitting the ground directly and going right into the wetland area, and maybe that whatever that can't hold will obviously end up in the neighboring community in the homes of people who live nearby. So
if I understand you correctly, then if the petition is to keep this habitat intact without any kind of infrastructure.
Correct.
Is that correct?
Correct.
You don't want any infrastructure there whatsoever. You want it left as is.
Well, we if there's personally, I think there needs to be infrastructure improvements, and they may have been, infrastructure improvements. I don't want to speak on that without any data to back it up. But as it relates to, I think the reality is that this land is privately. What the developer is building on is he can build as of right. So I guess the options that were presented to the community, it was a little bit, when these decisions were made, I don't know how much information. And I just moved to, as background, I just moved to the Staten Island like 3 years ago. So, but from what I understand, the community was made aware of these plans in the 11th hour. So they really didn't know what was going on until it was too late to weigh in, right? But the fact of the matter is the developer has the right to build as of right. And I guess, this plan that was negotiated to reduce to provide a permit for him to build the warehouse allowed for some, I guess, compromise in terms of enhancing the wetland. And that's in quotes, but I don't know how much. Again, I'm not an engineer, but I'm just going off of what I see. Again, it's just not the infrastructure, because infrastructure can also mean roadways, right? But how I see it is now you have more traffic. Now you have to accommodate more cars. There's a whole bunch of other things that are also connected with the wetland that actually doesn't exist. It's not wetland specific, but there are, related matters, as it relates to quality of life issues in the community that are directly tied to that development, the use of that site. So, no one would argue against infrastructure investment on Staten Island, but, I think the issue is that, if we had to pick, I think the people who are fighting to protect the wetland understand the value. And I think most people understand that, wetlands are valuable. I think just for a long time, there is a discussion of like ownership of that part of the land. And this, again, as I said, the land was sold to a private developer. And so he does have the right to build. And this latest development in terms of a warehouse was one of several plans for that site, from what I understand. I think at one point there was even a plan to build a NASCAR racetrack at the site. Regardless of what was proposed for the site, the community that lives there has a real anxiety about flooding and just quality of life and pollution. And so, you know, to keep the land as is really just to protect the health and well-being of the community.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. Lori asks, is your group represented on the local planning and zoning boards to influence some of this development?
I mean, there are several groups involved, you know, from civic associations to nonprofits. I mean, I know the group that I, you know, volunteered with has been very instrumental in like raising these issues both locally and beyond New York City on the community board as well. And the community board actually voted no on this proposal. So they are, you know, I think again that our elected officials voted against the community board's vote, and as I mentioned, with the thought that there was little they could do legally, and so this was like the best compromise that they could get. As I said, it was either this or this, right? The substantially less trees and no type of like, you know, efforts to address some of the environmental concerns at all, right? So yeah, so that's that. It was, you know, it's a difficult situation either way, but I think how people feel is that we're gonna try to like push and see how much we can actually, you know, A, raise awareness, and B, put pressure to say, look, you know, this is going to,
I'm coming.
this is gonna, yeah, this is gonna.
The lady shared a nice article from the US.
Hold on, somebody's unmuted.
Okay.
Mute Shar here.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Let's see. Let me see if there's anything else here in the chat box. Steve Kinney is wondering, will increasing amounts of wetlands increase the risk of mosquito-borne illnesses?
I mean, I know that the every year they spray for the Nile virus around here. I don't know if, you know, I don't know, like if, I mean, they're going to continue to spray regardless, right? I don't know if reducing the amount of wetlands is necessarily going to be the cure-all for the Nile virus. Maybe it is, maybe it's not, I don't know. But it seems like an incredible cost to pay, you know, in order to prevent mosquito-borne illnesses. So, I mean, I think that a lot of this is just boils down to development. Staten Island historically has been like, zoned in certain areas to not have a lot of density. And so many of the borough is very kind of suburban. For New York City, you know, you're gonna find more residential 1 or 2 family homes here more than any other area in New York City. And so it puts more pressure to develop where the land is cheaper. And as I mentioned, that's more low-lying areas that have more risk, more flood risk. And none of that is necessarily discussed once someone purchases a home in that area. Like no one told me, hey, you live this is actually like in a community that potentially might flood in 50 years. Like no one's gonna mention that, right? So I think there's a lot of education just around land use, urban ecology, and again, the history of the community, right? That certain industries tend to be located in communities historically have not had the political might or ability to really push back on these issues. So I mentioned these maps, and that's a big deal. Now, as I mentioned, the green belt, which it used to be at Fresh Kill, which used to be a landfill, which now, you know, there was a lot of work done to actually rehabilitate the park, and it's still ongoing. You know, the wetland there is actually protecting the local community that lives near it that had for many years been dealing with a lot of environmental issues, right? So now they've turned this problem into an asset. It's going to be one of the largest parks in New York City, if not America, and it's pretty, interesting to see the role it played during Superstorm Sandy in protecting the neighboring community. So, I mean, will it, is that going to increase West Nile virus or anything? Who knows, but did it protect the local community from a lot of other devastation? Definitely, yes. So.
Well, Christy and Ajahn, part of the reason I asked the question was not only just to see whether or not there was maybe an increase in mosquito-borne illnesses, but the whole thing is that, sometimes there are unanticipated things that can really sidetrack or, destabilize a movement. And the thing is, I can just see, we talked about some of the racial injustice in various neighborhoods.
Right.
I can just see if you've got these nice wetlands coming and all of a sudden you get an outbreak of some mosquito-borne illness near an affluent neighborhood. I can see that creating potentially quite a political hot potato as far as, gee, maybe we should close that wetland down after all because it's just breeding, disease.
The West Nile virus does not come from salt marsh mosquitoes. That's not accurate. You can look that up online. The salt marsh mosquito, the species in the salt marsh, does not carry West Nile virus.
Yeah, I didn't say it did. I'm just.
I'm just saying it doesn't. So I mean, that's if that was an argument that was made, that would be scientifically inaccurate.
Okay.
Okay, so another plus for conserving the wetland, but so Ajahn, what to Steve's point, do you find that often? I mean, has there been political pushback of any sort? I mean, other than from the developer?
Yeah,
based on these health concerns or any concerns really?
No, the main argument is this. This is a community that the need is high, right? So there's always issues of food insecurity. There's issues of employment or higher unemployment. There's higher poverty in the community than other parts of the island. So bringing a store of this magnitude would be an economic development generator in a lot of ways, right? You can hire people. There's local council members making the argument that it's a food justice issue because now you're building a BJ's, so now the local community can have access to healthier food in theory. So those are some of the arguments. I mean, on the flip side, local merchants have said, such big box stores will actually aid in displacement, right? And they can't compete against those types of big box stores. And then there's also like the fact that, in this area of Staten Island, because of the zoning in the past that allowed for larger big box stores, it's all concentrated on one part of the island, which leads to more traffic and poor air quality and and so it's it's happening in a community that doesn't have much transportation options, right? So the look and the feel of the neighborhood is very different than if you were on the other side of the island where it's more mom and pop and there's more attention paid to pedestrianizing the neighborhood as much as possible. So yeah, I think that look, you could sit on different sides of the argument, but as I said, for me personally, moving from Brooklyn, I never really had to think about air quality issues that much, so when I came here and started smelling like what's with this constant smell, I'm like, this is not normal. And then you talk to people and it's, and people just kind of accept it, right? First it was the landfill, and then so it's, people are aware of it, but they just kind of they deal with it, and so I think this is an opportunity to say, that yes, we have to live with the burdens of, of industry, right? Living downwind from these petrochemical companies and then having to have just, less open green space and all that. but at least let's protect the little green space that we do have. Like, one thing I would love to see is just that land being cleaned up. There's a lot of like abandoned cars and, you know, things that was left in there from years ago when people would just dump. You know, dumping is a big problem on Staten Island. Let's clean it up. Let's open up a nature center. Let's have some recreational activities to really, get kids connected to nature, those who really need it, who don't have access. Because, the borough is actually known as the borough of parks, but the parks are not equitably displaced in every neighborhood, right? So I think, yes, I would love to, in an ideal world, you'd be able to address all those issues, the employment issue, the access to outdoors issue, the conservation issue. I think but again, like if you have, I think the issue is how the land came into private ownership, and I think that's where the issue started, and that's kind of where it ends, because at the end of the day, it becomes a legal matter, and anything short of eminent domain, I won't probably like change that, or unless someone can just buy the developer out and then put the land in a trust, right, for the community, which would be great, but again, I think it's still worth like pushing to see what can be done, and at least raising the level of awareness that not only the rich, wealthier areas in New York City care about green space, but the working class community colors do too, right? We want our kids to breathe fresh air. We want them to have access. We want to introduce them to nature at a young age so they can be stewards, right? In the future. And this, climate change, we live on an island, so anything related to sea level rise is definitely going to impact all of Staten Island, not just the East Shore or the part closer to the Atlantic Ocean, right?
Okay, thank you. Christy Mickham, do you have your hand raised to ask a question, or was? Okay, I see the little yellow hand there, but I don't see her. Okay, well, I think that's all for questions. Alice Gerard did comment that transportation in this country is a disaster, especially for people who don't own cars and communities where there's low car ownership.
Right, correct.
So, okay, all right. Well, thank you so much, Ajamu. That was wonderful.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks for listening. And yeah, feel free to take a look at the petition. You can read more. There's lots of information about this topic online. So, feel free to drop me a line if you want to discuss it offline as well. And enjoy the rest of your week.
Okay, thanks so much.